The big lie is looming large over today's Arizona primaries, with election deniers on the ballot for the state's most powerful offices. Republican Congressman Andy Biggs, who refused to certify the 2020 race, is the party's frontrunner in the GOP primary for governor. And the races for Secretary of State and Attorney General both include candidates who have talked about the election being stolen from Trump. But, as you are about to hear, some voters in the state, well, they are pretty tired of relitigating that race.
What do you make of hearing politicians talk about 2020 fraud claims?
It's bullshit. I mean, we can count the vote, and we should allow everybody to vote and make sure everything is counted honestly, and I don't believe in rigged.
Get over it. You lost. Get over it. You're like a child.
It's like, come on, that's foolishness, and no, that's just a waste of time, and I don't like that.
It's sad that someone that doesn't win just claims that it was all a sham. But if he would have won, would he have also claimed it was a sham? Probably not.
Joining me now, MS Now senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard and Brian Tyler Cohen, political commentator and host of the podcast No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. He has millions of subscribers. He's also the author of The Day After, How to Wield Power in a Post-Trump World. It is good to see you both, Vaughn. I am always happy when you get to be our Arizona correspondent. You spent a lot of time there.
I wish I was there right now.
I know. But you know what? We're going to connect the dots because what happened in Arizona sort of led you to where you are right now. What can you tell us about these candidates? They're all over the ballot.
Right. First, on the Democratic side, the slate of incumbents are running again. You have Chris Mays for Attorney General, Adrian Fontes for Secretary of State, and Katie Hobbs for Governor. And so the question here in today's primary is, who are each of these folks going to run against in the Republican side? And when you look at Andy Biggs, he is leading substantially in the polls. We expect him to win tonight. He is one of those Arizona congressmen that objected to the certification of Arizona's results on January 6, 2021. But he was also somebody in text messages that was revealed through the January 6 committee proceedings to send text messages to Mark Meadows, the then chief of staff, just 3 days after the 2020 election, saying that there should be alternate slate of electors. And Mark Meadows replied, "I love it." He was somebody who was a proponent of the idea that Vice President Mike Pence should reject the electors that were there on January 6 and instead put forward those that had backed Donald Trump. And then Alex Collin, Secretary of State, he was somebody that was actually a lawyer that was part of that Kraken lawsuit that was fronted by Sidney Powell, somebody who has called for essentially the complete end of mail-in voting, and somebody who is expected to win here tonight. Again, this is really just thrusting election deniers at the forefront of the Republican Party in Arizona.
Well, and the thing is, Brian, that has huge consequences because you think back to 2020, there were election officials in Arizona who were willing to stand firm against the president's demands to say that there was no fraud. What would it mean if suddenly the people in charge, all levels of government, the governor, the Secretary of State, the Attorney General, if they are willing to buy into Trump's claims?
Well, look, it would allow Trump the ability to do what he's been trying to do all along, which is to have basically full federal control to interfere in elections as he pleases. And this is clearly a huge priority for him. That's why he's invested so much time and energy into trying to pass the Save America Act, which basically amounts to a federal takeover of elections. It's why he tried to pass that executive order banning mail-in voting. That was blocked. It's why he refuses to rule out sending ICE to the polls. His top priority is just doing whatever he can to basically be able to take control of elections. And the sad part of all of this is he wouldn't need to do all of this if he bothered to just keep true to his own promises on the campaign trail. But he won't. He won't do anything to bring prices down. He won't do anything to release the Epstein files. He won't do anything to avoid foreign wars. And so instead, because he's not willing to earn people's votes, he has to try and rig the rules of the game in his favor.
Help me understand, Juan, just the politics of this. You have Congressman Biggs asked 3 times about the 2020 election outcome. He told USA Today he would not be pitted against Trump, who remains, of course, wedded to these unsubstantiated allegations. What is the strategy there? Like, who in the base is he trying to appeal to by not putting distance between himself and Trump?
He knows that Kari Lake lost by 17,000 votes 4 years ago. And Kari Lake ran on election denialism And there was a few weeks back in the 2022 campaign where she tried to, you could say, moderate or focus on issues like the economy and water rights. But then she time and again lifted up people like Steve Bannon and Charlie Kirk onto the campaign stage, and who were making the case that Donald Trump was the rightful winner. And Andy Biggs is somebody who shares a very similar record. And that is a recognition and an acknowledgement that in a general election, he's going to have to change, because time and again, there have been more Democrats elected statewide since the 2020 election than Republicans. And if Andy Biggs wants to win, he's got to change his tenor. The last rally that I was at with Andy Biggs, a Trump rally, he referred to himself and others in the crowd as the ultra MAGA-ers. The question is, most of Arizona, they're not ultra MAGA-ers. Can he win back those old school traditional conservatives in the independent voters that now time and again in recent elections have gone towards Democrats?
Right, and how many people, like the folks we were listening to in that parking lot, are actually turned off by the fact that they are so stuck on 2020. Brian, Arizona has been battling the Trump administration over election rules. I want you to take a listen to the current Secretary of State, Adrian Fontes, reacting to demands from the DHS Secretary about purging non-citizens from voter rolls.
He can go suck on a salt lick. The guy has no idea what he's talking about. Professional election administrators like myself are really, I'm sick and tired of being insulted by these folks who are completely ignorant as to how these systems work. I don't know what these folks are talking about. It's a perpetuation of the campaign of grievance that Donald Trump has continued on. And maybe he's setting something up to try to make some excuses for what might be happening in the fall.
Brian Tyler Cohen, my fellow New Jerseyan, I thought we knew colorful language, but I got to give it to the Arizonans because
suck on a salt lick was definitely not on my bingo card today, but I love that one. I'll be borrowing that one.
I'm curious, two things. One is just how ugly you think this can get, and I've been thinking about this question in the context of your book about the fact that we are now in a period where everything is on the defensive, right? And we're trying to make sure that they do not reduce the number of people who are able to participate in our elections. But it's like we're living in the upside down, Brian, right? Where it's like we should be having a conversation about how we make it easier for people to vote and how you include more people in the democratic process. When we get there, how do you make sure this never happens again?
I think that this is the perfect example of what it looks like in terms of the asymmetry between how the two sides wield power. Obviously, Donald Trump is wielding it so that he can consolidate more control for himself. He's doing it so that he can engage in more self-enrichment. He's doing it so that his family can continue to consolidate these military defense contracts. And so this should be a lesson to Democrats that this asymmetry in terms of how the two parties wield power is completely unacceptable, and that if and when Democrats get into power again, they should learn a lesson from this. Watch the way in which Donald Trump is not adhering blindly to norms and traditions and institutions and processes, but instead doing it to get whatever he wants. Now, my contention, what I argue in this book, is that Democrats need to do this to deliver on virtuous outcomes, to make sure that they barrel through these obstacles and hurdles so that they can deliver on health care, on climate change legislation, on voting rights legislation, you name it. But right now, I think that the extent to which Trump is willing to just abuse any power he has, but to do it for himself, can't be overstated.